The old man on the assembly line at Cav Electrics kept to himself. He ate lunch alone, spoke with a heavy accent, and never talked about his past. His co-workers knew nothing about him, just another stateless immigrant doing manual labor. A man whose citizenship had been stripped by the communists, and whose reputation had been stolen by the British. The hands that once signed orders for thousands of paratroopers now fumbled with small, greasy components. The eyes that had scanned maps of Europe for strategic advantage now strained under fluorescent lights, checking for assembly defects. He worked there for nearly 20 years, tightening screws, assembling parts, earning barely enough to survive. No pension, no recognition, no one asking questions. When he died of heart failure in September 1967, his co-workers attended the funeral out of courtesy. They expected a brief quiet service for a factory hand they barely knew. Then the priest began reading his military record. Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, commander of the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, defender of Warsaw, veteran of the largest airborne operation in military history, the man who had warned the British that Operation Market Garden would fail and was destroyed for being right. September 12, 1944. A conference room in England filled with Allied commanders planning the most ambitious airborne assault ever attempted. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had convinced Eisenhower to approve Operation Market Garden. 3 airborne divisions would drop behind German lines in the Netherlands, seizing bridges across the Rhine. If it worked, Allied tanks could pour into Germany. The war might end by Christmas. General Roy Urquhart of the British 1st Airborne Division presented the plan. So Sosabowski sat in the back, studying the maps with growing alarm. The drop zones were 7 miles from the Arnhem Bridge. 7 miles of hostile territory that lightly armed paratroopers would have to cross on foot. To a civilian, 7 miles sounds like a morning hike. To a general, it is an eternity. It meant paratroopers would lose the element of surprise before they fired a shot. The landings would be spread across 3 days due to aircraft shortages. 3 days without surprise, without concentration of force, and British intelligence claimed the area was lightly defended. Sosabowski knew this was fantasy. When Urquhart finished and asked for questions, Sosabowski wanted to stand up and call the plan impossible. He wanted to demand written orders so he wouldn't be blamed for the disaster that would follow. But he stayed silent. He later admitted he was already unpopular with British commanders. Who would have listened anyway? The question haunted him for the rest of his life. Sosabowski had raised concerns before. During planning for Operation Comet, Market Garden's predecessor, he told Lieutenant General Frederick Browning that the mission was equivalent to suicide. Dropping a single airborne division to capture all those bridges was impossible. His objections were supported by other officers, including Brigadier Hackett. Eventually, Comet was cancelled, but Market Garden was Comet with more troops. The fundamental problems remained. At one planning session, a British officer presented optimistic assessments of German weakness. The enemy was beaten, demoralized, incapable of serious resistance. Sosabowski interrupted in his deep accented voice. But the Germans, General, the Germans. The room went cold. This wasn't just disagreement. It was a breach of etiquette. A foreign officer speaking accented English, telling the heroes of the British Empire that their master plan was a death trap. You can imagine the uncomfortable shifting in chairs, the shared glances between British officers, the unspoken consensus that Sosabowski was being difficult simply by being realistic. Sosabowski tried to explain Arnhem was the gateway into Germany. The Wehrmacht would defend it with everything they had. The assumption of light resistance was delusional. Browning dismissed him as a doom thinker, a pessimist who didn't understand the momentum of Allied victory. Sosabowski pointed out that the drop zones were too far from objectives, that spreading landings over 3 days would forfeit surprise, that lightly armed paratroopers couldn't hold against armored counterattacks. Every concern was waved away. The operation would proceed as planned. What Sosabowski didn't know was that a young intelligence officer, Major Brian Urquhart, no relation to the general, had photographic evidence of German tanks near Arnhem. SS Punner divisions were refitting in the exact area where British paratroopers would land. Browning dismissed that warning too. The tanks were probably unserviceable, he said, manned by old men and boys. September 17, 1944, the largest airborne operation in history, launched without Sosabowski. His Polish brigade was scheduled to reinforce the British on the third day, but Sosabowski wasn't watching with hope. He was watching with dread. Reports filtered back to England. The British had landed 7 miles from the bridge, exactly the problem Sosabowski had warned about. German resistance was heavier than expected, exactly as he predicted. Then the weather closed in. Fog grounded Sosabowski's aircraft on September 19th. He sat at the airfield helpless, while the operation he had warned against collapsed without him. By September 20th, fragments of news made clear the disaster. British paratroopers were surrounded. The bridge was held by a single battalion. German armor was crushing positions that were never supposed to face tanks. Everything Sosabowski had said in that briefing room was coming true, and he couldn't do anything except wait for weather that wouldn't clear. September 21st, 1944, 4 days into an operation planned to last 2. So, Sosabowski finally received clearance, but not to the original zone. His brigade would land at Driel on the south bank of the Rhine, opposite the trapped British. Anti-aircraft fire tore into the transport aircraft. So, he jumped with 950 men, barely a third of his full brigade. The rest were scattered across English airfields, recalled by weather messages they never received. The ferry they needed had been sunk. The British were dying on the north bank, and so Sosabowski had no way to reach them. His men paddled across in rubber boats under machine gun fire. The boats were small toys, really, as they pushed into the black water of the Rhine. Then, flares popped overhead, turning night into day, and German guns on the high ground opened up. Sosabowski watched from the bank as the river ran red. About 200 Poles made it across. The rest were killed, wounded, or driven back. Sosabowski had warned them this would happen. Now he was watching his men die, proving him right. September 24th, 1944. The British perimeter at Osterbank was collapsing. Sosabowski attended a conference at 43rd Wessex Division headquarters. Lieutenant General Horrocks of 30th Corps was there, along with Major General Thomas and other British commanders. They discussed plans for a night crossing. 2 battalions would attempt to reinforce the trapped paratroopers. Sosabowski studied the plan and felt sick. The proposed crossing point was directly beneath German positions on the Westering Heights. His men would be slaughtered. He raised his objections. They needed either a major assault with the entire 43rd Division or an evacuation of the British forces. This half measure would achieve nothing except casualties. The British commanders were tired of Sosabowski's objections. They didn't ask for his opinion. They simply announced that Polish troops would participate in the crossing under British command. Sosabowski was furious. His brigade was being committed without his consent to an operation he knew would fail. Horrocks ended the meeting by reprimanding him. If Sosabowski wouldn't obey orders, Horrocks would find someone who would. The crossing went ahead. It was a disaster, exactly as Sosabowski predicted. September 25th and 26th, 1944, the order came to evacuate. Sosabowski's Polish brigade covered the withdrawal. His men provided security, while the shattered remnants of 1st Airborne pedaled to safety in the darkness. The brigade had been bled dry. Between the chaotic drops and the river crossing, nearly 400 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Sosabowski gathered his survivors and prepared to return to England. He had done everything asked of him. His men had fought with extraordinary courage under impossible conditions. He expected no praise. He knew how the British handled failure. Someone would have to be blamed, and Sosabowski had made himself the obvious target by being right about everything. October 5, 1944. Sosabowski received a letter from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The letter praised the Polish soldiers for fighting bravely at Arnhem. Montgomery offered military decorations to 10 members of the brigade. The tone was gracious and appreciative. Sosabowski read the letter with cautious relief. Perhaps the British understood what his men had accomplished. Perhaps they recognized that the Poles had done their duty, despite impossible circumstances. He had no reason to suspect what was coming. 9 days later, Montgomery wrote a very different letter. This one wasn't addressed to Sosabowski. It was sent to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, and it was classified. October 14, 1944. Montgomery's secret message reached London. The Polish Parachute Brigade, Montgomery wrote, fought very badly here. The men showed no keenness to fight. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, contradicted by every after-action report, every eyewitness, every British officer who had served alongside the Poles. Montgomery recommended that Sosabowski's brigade be transferred to Italy. He didn't want them under his command. He suggested the Poles were no longer useful to the Allied war effort. The timing wasn't coincidental. The Moscow Conference was happening simultaneously. Churchill was meeting with Stalin to discuss Poland's future. The British Prime Minister was pressuring the Polish government in exile to accept Soviet demands. Montgomery's telegram gave Churchill leverage. If Poland's most elite brigade was supposedly worthless, Poland's negotiating position was weaker. Churchill could use the accusation to pressure Polish leaders. Lieutenant General Browning supported Montgomery's assessment. He formally requested Sosabowski's removal on December 1st, citing the need for a younger, more cooperative officer. The real reason was obvious. Sosabowski had questioned the plan. He had been proved right, and that was unforgivable. As historian Michael Alfred Pesky later observed, the worst thing a subordinate can do is question orders and be proved right. December 1944. Churchill personally pressured the Polish government in exile for 2 months. The British wanted Sosabowski gone. They made clear that continued support for Poland depended on cooperation. Poland's exile government was weak. Their homeland was being occupied by the Soviets. They depended entirely on British goodwill for their survival. They had no choice. On Christmas Day 1944, Sosabowski's men learned their commander was being removed. The paratroopers who had followed him through Market Garden, who had watched their friends die in the rubber boats crossing the Rhine, were devastated. They started a hunger strike. These were elite soldiers who had survived one of the war's worst disasters. They were willing to starve themselves rather than accept the injustice being done to their general. Sosabowski heard about the protest and immediately intervened. He ordered his men to stop. He wouldn't let them suffer for his sake. On December 9, 1944, the Polish president sent the letter relieving Sosabowski of command. He formally handed over on December 27. 2 of his brigade officers resigned in protest. The general who had warned against Market Garden, who had been right about everything, was reassigned to command rearguard troops, a humiliating demotion for one of Poland's most distinguished officers. Montgomery and Browning had won. The scapegoat had been sacrificed. The war ended. Sosabowski could not go home. Communist Poland was controlled by the Soviets, the same Soviets his brigade had been created to fight. Officers who returned faced imprisonment, torture, or execution. In September, clear's throat, 1946, the communist Polish government stripped Sosabowski of his citizenship. He became a man without a country, stateless for the rest of his life. He managed to bring his wife and son from Poland. His son Stanislaw had lost his sight during the Warsaw Uprising, serving as a medic in the resistance. The family settled in West London with nothing. There was a cruel irony in their small home. The general who had seen the disaster coming when everyone else was blind to it now cared for a son who had literally lost his sight fighting for Poland. Two broken soldiers living in a country that wanted to forget them. Sosabowski had no pension. The British government provided no support for Polish veterans who had fought under British command. The exile government had no resources. At age 57, Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski applied for work at factories. He found a job at Cav Electrics in Acton, an assembly plant, manual labor, minimum wage. For nearly 20 years, he worked there. The man who had commanded elite paratroopers spent his days on a factory floor, anonymous and poor. His coworkers didn't know. He never talked about the war, never mentioned Montgomery or Market Garden or the bridges at Arnhem. In 1960, he published his memoirs. The book was called Freely I Served. Few people read it. He worked at the factory until he was 75 years old. September 25, 1967, Stanislaw Sosabowski died of heart failure at Hillington Hospital. He was buried in a London cemetery. His co-workers stood alongside weeping paratroopers, finally understanding who the quiet old man on the assembly line really was. It wasn't until 1969 that his loyal soldiers managed to bring his remains home to Warsaw. At the Powązki Military Cemetery, among the graves of Polish soldiers who had died fighting for their country, the general was finally laid to rest among his own. But it took decades more for full vindication. In 2006, Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands awarded the Military Order of William to the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade. It was one of the highest military honors the Dutch could bestow. Sosabowski himself was posthumously awarded the Bronze Lion. The Dutch government acted despite British diplomatic pressure against the recognition. A Dutch television documentary had finally told the truth about what happened at Driel. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands said the Poles deserved to be honored with at least a medal. The village square in Driel was renamed Sosa's Skipline. A statue of the general now stands there looking across at the house where he established his headquarters in September 1944. And finally, in 2025, 80 years late, the British government broke its silence. At a historic ceremony in Warsaw, the UK Defence Minister officially paid tribute to the extraordinary courage of Sosabowski and his men. The Polish government called it a restoration of honor. It wasn't a full apology for Montgomery's lies, but it was the vindication the general had been denied for his entire life. It took 8 decades for the truth to catch up to the politics. Montgomery got the statues and the fame in his lifetime. Sosabowski got something more lasting: the judgment of history. Browning escaped accountability entirely. He was knabbed after the war. His famous phrase about going a bridge too far became the title of the definitive book and film about the disaster. Sosabowski's crime was simple. He told the truth to men who didn't want to hear it. He was right when being right was unforgivable. History is written by the victors, they say. But in this case, history was written by men who needed to cover up their failure. The old man in the factory knew things his co-workers couldn't imagine. He had commanded men in combat, buried friends in foreign soil, and watched his warnings come true at the cost of thousands of lives. He never complained. He never sought recognition. He just worked his shift and went home. But as he stood on that assembly line, covered in grease and anonymity, Sosabowski possessed the one thing Montgomery never did: a clean conscience.